Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Now, around this time of the electoral cycle, we start getting speculation about when the next federal election will be held. Now, I don't want to contribute to that speculation. I find it pretty pointless, really. But the one thing I think is worth explaining is what are the constraints upon a Prime Minister in terms of choosing the date of the election? So what are the constitutional constraints and the constraints that apply because of the Electoral Act and the legislation that governs how elections are run? The first thing you need to understand is that each of the houses has a different electoral cycle, and that leads to difficulties about determining when an election is held. Now, while we're quite used to holding elections, which are elections for the full House of Representatives and a half Senate election, that's only because of the choice of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister would ordinarily choose a date for an election for the House of Representatives that falls within the window in which you can hold an election for half the Senate. So it doesn't necessarily have to be thus. Now, the House of Representatives, according to Section 28 of the Constitution, has a maximum term of 3 years. And that 3 years runs from the date that Parliament met after the previous election. But Parliament can, of course, be dissolved much earlier than that 3-year outlying maximum period, and it almost always does. So that happens where the Prime Minister advises the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and call an election, and the Governor-General, exercising their power, decides to do so. This means that if Parliament is not dissolved earlier by the Governor-General, the House of Representatives will expire on the 25th of July 2025, which is 3 years after the House first sat after the previous election on 26th of July 2022. So on that basis, the very latest an election could be held for the House of Representatives would be on 27th of September 2025, taking into account all the various periods set out by legislation from the date of expiration through to the holding of an election. Senators, in contrast, have 6-year terms that are fixed, and the terms of half of the senators expire on the 30th of June every 3 years, and their successors commence their term on the 1st of July every 3 years. But according to Section 13 of the Constitution, the election for half the Senate shall be held within a year before the term of the relevant senators expires. But that window to hold an election is in practice shortened to the period between August and May due to the election timetables that are imposed by the law. Now, that's because on the one end, there is a minimum period of 33 days between the expiry of Parliament and the polling day, making a half Senate election able to be called no earlier than August. On the other hand, at the other end, sufficient time needs to be given for the outcome of the election to be determined and the writs to be returned before the following 1st of July. So the latest polling date for a half Senate election is in the month of May before the 30th of June, when the Senate, for half the senators, their terms expire. So what does all this mean for the federal election? Well, in this video, I've excluded the possibility of a double dissolution election. That's because there's no current double dissolution trigger. And so we'll leave the idea of the dissolution of the full Senate along with the House of Representatives, which can be done, but is done only according to a very specific formula in Section 57 of the Constitution. I'm going to leave that to another video when it becomes relevant. So putting that aside, what does all this tell us about election dates? Well, it leaves us with a House of Representatives election and a half Senate election either being held together or being held separately. Now, no government wants to hold a separate Senate and House election. Why? Well, first of all, it would make the people cranky if they were hauled to the polls twice when it was otherwise unnecessary. There's a financial reason as well. It would drain the coffers of the relevant parties to hold two separate elections in short succession. And the government would probably suffer in the election, particularly the half-Senate election, by voters expressing their unhappiness about the experience. Now, a separate half-Senate election has not been held since 1970, and although we all have great nostalgia for the 1970s, probably no one wants to go back to that experience. So what does that mean? In practice, it means that the next House of Representatives election will be held at the same time as a half-Senate election, and therefore has to be held within that window of between August 2024 and May 2025. Now, within that window, the earliest possible date for an election is the 3rd of August 2024, and the latest possible date is 17th of May 2025, or at a pinch 24 May 2025. But that's the window of possibilities. But there's another complicating factor this time round, and that is the need for a redistribution, which is currently underway. Now, the Constitution contains in section 24 a formula for the allocation of seats between the various states, and that's based upon their share of the population. So as the proportion of the population changes over time amongst the various states, the number of seats within those states change, and that requires a redistribution within the relevant state. Now, the process for doing that is set out in the Electoral Act, and it relies on data which is provided by the Australian statistician. And an assessment is made about this by the Electoral Commissioner 1 year after the first sitting day after a new House of Representatives is elected. So accordingly, in July in 2023, the Electoral Commissioner announced that after going through that process, Western Australia's share of the population had increased sufficiently to give it an extra seat, whereas both New South Wales and Victoria were going to lose a seat each. Now, it might strike you that that's a bit odd because it means 2 seats down and 1 seat up, so it means there will be 1 fewer seat in the federal parliament, and that's right. So the federal parliament will be going from 151 seats in the House of Representatives to 150 seats for quite complicated reasons about formulas and remainders, etc. But anyway, trust me on that, that works. Okay, so the redistribution process takes quite a while to go through. It involves periods in which there's consultation where people get to have a say. So there's a period for the public to make suggestions about what the new boundaries of electorates should be, and then they're made public, and then other people can comment on those suggestions, and then the Redistribution Commission then sets out its proposed changes, and then people can make objections to those, and then they're published, and then other people can comment on those objections. So it's a fair process. Everybody gets to have a say. Consequence of that is that it does actually take quite a while, and the current timetable for going through that is for it to finish around about September or October in 2024. Now, as the electoral boundaries may change quite significantly within those affected states as a consequence of the redistribution, the government is going to want to know what these new electoral boundaries are in order to sort out its pre-selections and bed down its candidates before it holds an election. So realistically, an election is probably not going to be held in 2024 because of that. But you ask, well, what would happen if the government decided to hold an election before the redistribution was complete? Would it be done on the existing electorate boundaries? And the answer to that is no. The Electoral Act provides instead that once you've done that calculation, which shows that Western Australia gets an extra seat and New South Wales and Victoria lose a seat, once that calculation has been done, if an election is then held before the redistribution is finalised, instead you have what is called a mini-redistribution. Now, the rules for that are set out in Section 76 of the Electoral Act, and the redistribution commissioners still have to reduce the number of seats in New South Wales and Victoria by 1 and increase the number of seats in Western Australia. So how do they do that? Well, the rules say that first of all they have to identify lists of all pairs of contiguous electoral divisions in the relevant state. And that is those electoral divisions whose boundaries touch at one place. And that, according to the AEC, although this might be disputed, includes where boundaries are only separated by water, like a river or the whole of Sydney Harbour, which will become relevant. Anyway, then by using the electoral enrolment data that's provided by the Australian statistician, and that's the data that was last published before the writ for the election is issued, they then calculate the pair of contiguous electorates which has the highest overall enrolment and the lowest overall enrolment. Now, when you need to get rid of a seat, you turn the two contiguous seats which have the collective lowest enrolment into one seat. If you want to add a seat, as will need to be done in Western Australia, you take the two contiguous seats which have the largest collective enrolment and you turn them into 3 electorates with approximately the same number of electors in each of those 3 electorates. Now, in those circumstances, all the other electorates remain exactly the same. So how would this play out in practice, at least on the basis of current enrolment statistics? Well, fortunately, Anthony Green has done the sums, and he tells us that in New South Wales, the seats of Warringah and Wentworth would be merged. Now, this is on the basis that the AEC is actually right, and the fact that they're separated by Sydney Harbour is still enough to make them contiguous seats. But if they are treated as contiguous seats, then the consequence of that is that you'd see 2 of the Teal independents, Zali Steggall and Allegra Spender, facing off against each other to try and win the seat. In Victoria, the seats of Chisholm and Higgins would be merged, and that would pit 2 Labor members against each other. So Michelle Ananda Raja in Higgins and Labor's Karina Garland in Chisholm. Now, in Western Australia, it's the seats of Perth and Cowan that would be merged and then divided into 3 seats. And so their current members of the 2 seats are, again, Labor members Anne Ali and Patrick Gorman, and they would have parts of their seats altered with a new seat created. But the new boundaries of those seats would not be known until after the writ was issued for the election, and the Electoral Commission, its Redistribution Commission, decided this within 7 days. All up, it's unlikely that the government would prefer to face this mini-redistribution with all the uncertainty that it involves, rather than wait for the final redistribution to be determined and enough time be given to properly pre-select candidates, etc. The final relevance factor in all of this is other distractions and events. So, for example, there's an ACT election on the 19th of October, followed by a Queensland state election on the 26th of October. And that pretty much wipes out October as a month for a federal election, even if the redistribution was done in time, which is doubtful. The Christmas period and school holidays are also a factor that politicians take into account. No one really wants to be campaigning over the Christmas and January period. Elections have, however, been held in November and early December, so that is at least a possibility. Going on into 2025, the Western Australian election will be held on the 8th of March, and we also have Easter on the 20th of April. So the most realistic options for a federal election would either be, if it was going to be a bit earlier, in the November, early December period in 2024, and that again is subject to when the redistribution is finalised by the AEC and whether there's enough time for the government to think that it's ready to hold an election, or alternatively probably much later towards the end of the government's term in May 2025. Now, of course, if there was some great political advantage in going immediately to an election and choosing a different date for some reason, the government could always decide to just wear the consequences of any kind of inconvenience that is resulting from an election date. So that is always a possibility, but it's a fairly remote one. It's unlikely. The more likely outcome is an election either in November, December, or in May next year. So I hope you found this explanation useful about the constraints that are placed on Prime Ministers, and I hope you can use it to impress your friends and family with your profoundly deep knowledge about such technical matters. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the Constitutional Clarion. Goodbye.